Okay, good afternoon everybody, and welcome to this lecture from the Institute of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Keele. Just to introduce myself, my name is David Amigoni, I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and Enterprise here at Keele, and I'm standing in today for Professor Jonathan Wassling, Dean of the Faculty of Natural Sciences and Director of the Institute, who sends his apologies today. It's a great pleasure to welcome to the Institute Dr. Andrew Magette, who is going to be talking today about the new higher education settlement, standards, excellence, value add and finance. And I can tell you already that Andrew is following this debate very closely, checking in on his phone every few moments to what's going on in the House of Lords, which we know is an important, which has some important matters for our consideration going on today. So welcome to this partnership event with the School of Social Sciences and Public Policy, and particular thanks to Dr. Peter Jones from the school, who has worked with ILAS in coordinating Andrew's visit. Andrew Magette is a researcher and a journalist who writes about higher education with a focus on finance, mathematics, philosophy and the arts. He's co-founder of the Fine Art Maths Centre at Central St Martin's and teaches the history and philosophy of mathematics at City Literary Institute. And he holds a doctorate from the Centre of Research in Modern European Philosophy, and now that's based at Kingston University in London. Andrew's writing has appeared in The Guardian, The Observer, Times Higher Education, Research Fortnight, London Review of Books and Radical Philosophy, and he regularly blogs on higher education, financing and policy. He's very well known himself for, as he himself describes it, as his, in brackets, unfortunately, prescient book, in the sense of, this is the situation we find ourselves, The Great University Gamble, Money, Markets and the Future of Higher Education. And his most recent publications include a pamphlet on student loan accounting for Higher Education Policy Institute. Is that the one that you actually have with you today? I do have 3 copies of it. Yeah, so if you are interested in the technical side of things, there are things that you can take away with you. An article for the London Review of Books on attempts to sell student loan accounts, Cash Today, which appeared on 5th of March 2015, and 2 working papers on the Political Economy Research Centre at Goldsmiths on the place of human capital theory in the Treasury's approach to higher education, and that appeared in May 2015. Now, looking around this packed room, it's very clear that people recognise that Andrew's work is relevant to everyone in higher education, and his lecture, for the reasons that I've just outlined, couldn't be more timely with the Higher Education and Research Bill currently being debated by Parliament. We very much look forward to what he has to say. Just a couple of points. Andrew is very happy for people to put up hands and just say, "Can you clarify something?" If that's the case in the course of his lecture. So just so that you know that. And also, when we come to questions at the end, which Andrew is very happy to take, he would quite like to take 2 or 3 questions at a time and answer more generically. So. With that in mind, please can I pass over and please can we welcome Dr. Andrew Magette to talk about the new HE settlement, standards, excellence and value and finance.
Thank you, David, for the introduction. Thank you, Peter, for the invitation, and thank you, Joe, for organising, and thanks to all you for turning out today. As David said, I'm a bit of a hostage to fortune in what I'm about to present because, as I speak, the House of Lords is debating the Higher Education Research Bill, which, if all goes to plan, should become law by the end of today. So in order to avoid putting my foot in it around issues like this or having to tell you stuff that then does happen or does not happen, I'm mainly going to talk about things which are happening anyway, have already been underway perhaps for the last 18 months, perhaps since the last general election, and mainly leave questions about the technicalities of the Higher Education Research Bill aside, which from my perspective as someone who mainly writes about the financing of undergraduate tuition and the financing of institutions, is primarily about the creation of the new office for students. But there's a whole load of policy things underway which play a part, I think, in what we might call the sort of infrastructure of that the office for students will sit at the heart of. So one of the things I won't talk so much about for that reason is also for similar reasons, is the teaching excellence framework, which I'm presuming from what I've been told about the audience, people are already familiar with, but I'm happy to take questions about it. In a certain sense, I'd like to concentrate, and hopefully I'll get to, in the time allotted to me, is to talk more about the longitudinal earnings outcomes, which I think is much less familiar to people. We were expecting a whole load of new data to be published in the next month or so, but because of the PERDA regulations, we will not get it now until after the general election. But I'll show you some pilot data from that at the end. And really, I think that's very important for institutions and subjects to begin thinking about now, because I think it demands a different kind of narrative than we're used to giving. And hopefully, I'll get to that time. One of the problems with talking about what's been going on in higher education is so much is going on at so many levels. It's a fast-changing terrain. You know, my book was written in 2012 and published in 2013, and large parts of it are now just simply, outmoded by the times. It's one of the difficulties of writing about higher education is at the moment is keeping track of everything that's happening. So this sketch that I'll present is probably slightly contentious for many people. I'm happy to debate that afterwards, but I see what's happening at the moment as effectively the new settlement to replace what happened in 1992, 93, when the polytechnics were brought into the university funding, and we had a single unitary funding scheme and largely regulatory scheme for higher education. This is as big as that in my interpretation, and that's really what I sort of want to outline to you, is how I read that and what I think the kind of key contours of that are. So here's my overview, and if I don't get through all of it, at least you'll have a sense of where I want to end up. The key thing here, I would say, is that the government, and particularly the Treasury, has a long time ago left behind the idea in the 1990s that there was a generic value to any undergraduate degree. And so we would encourage people to go to university to study whatever subject because they would come out of it with a certain kind of graduateness, a certain kind of characteristics associated with a graduate. That has pretty much gone, and there's cross-party consensus, I'd now say, certainly for the last 5-10 years, that they can no longer have confidence in that. And there's a certain level of resentment directed at universities that they haven't upheld their side of the bargain, and the bargain here being expansion, extra funding, but universities haven't delivered what they were expecting to see. And therefore, a large part of what I'd see as the new settlement is interrogating what universities deliver in terms of undergraduate provision, opening that up to new data, new regulatory mechanisms, and that's really what I'll sort of show to you this afternoon. So I'll explain this in terms of why it's really all about human capital investment from the Treasury point of view, and then how a new interpretation of standards, understood as accountability, new interpretation of competition, particularly through the competition and markets authorities and the role of the Office for Students as a market regulator, and then look at these new kinds of information, and that's when I'll talk about longitudinal earnings outcomes. And my sort of pitch to you as academics is that this is a professional problem, and it's an institutional problem, in that as a sector we're very used to defending autonomy and academic freedom as an idea of resisting direct political interference. A university coming into an institution and saying, you can't teach that, we want you to take those students. We don't really have the intellectual history and resources to draw upon to think about these new forms of indirect interference through particularly financial metrics. And the earnings outcomes of graduates here is the key one that I invite you to think about. And as I say, although I think there is a new settlement, lots of it is very ambiguous. So it's not as if some of the stuff I show you, I really don't know what it means, and I don't mean that through any false modesty. I think it's a general intellectual problem for institutions, and one which we'll have to wrestle with over the next 5 to 10 years. So that's my kind of overview. And I will move through these slides quite quickly to give you a sense of that, and I'll stick on certain ones. And to reiterate what David said, if you have clarificatory questions, please do hit me with them as I go along, because I know some of this stuff is very unfamiliar to people, and it's much easier to deal with those clarificatory questions at that point rather than taking them at the end. Okay, so this is the familiar position. Since the late 80s, we have moved from an elite higher education system to a mass higher education system in England. And my chart here stops at 2010, but there's been another little surge in the last 5 years, and we're roughly now at 50% participation of people under 30 in higher education in this country. And the 1992 settlement is around here for that initial phase of moving from elite to mass. We're at the sort of end of this wave of expansion, and now it's time for an assessment, if you like, from the investors, and the investors in this case are the government or the Treasury. And I'm not going to say very much about this, because I take this to be, the terrain for the next few years. I mean, I think it's telling that although the Labour Party's policy manifesto will pledge the restoration of the EMA, the Educational Maintenance Allowance, and restore maintenance grants and restore bursaries for nursing, there's been no mention of the zero tuition fee pledge. But basically, there's a series of arguments in favour of the new fee regime, and I'm largely ventriloquising here. I don't necessarily believe in these, but I think these are important to understand. Universities were spared austerity. There is no more rationing of places. The recruitment caps for undergraduate came off in 2015. There is new loan support for part-time, new loan support for postgraduate, and in a certain sense, loans are seen to be a fairer way of funding higher education, in that it reflects the private gain to individual. And HE is not a universal provision, unlike other levels of primary and secondary education. And there is still some kind of public subsidy, although it's opaque, complex, difficult to convey to people. There's a huge number of protections built into the fee loan structure for future low earners. But precisely in what I'm about to show you, here's where the ambiguity comes in. That subsidy that protects low earners is also the focus of policy and the new settlement. It's trying to ensure there's less subsidy, because those people go on to be higher earners. I'll skip this graph, but that's mainly explaining something. And the general consensus is that the scheme is fair and progressive. Maintenance support is adequate for students while studying, and graduate disposable income can support loan repayments without being burdensome. Those are largely tenets of belief. There's very little evidence to back any of these, and certainly if you teach in London, it's becoming much more of a concern that the student maintenance support is adequate for students while studying. But that's not the theme of my talk, but I'd say this is what everything else sits inside of. We sit inside a fee loan regime, and a large part of the settlement is looking at how then the universities function within this fee loan regime. Okay, so this is a quote from Milton Friedman's The Role of Government in 1955, and I would consider this to be the text for understanding higher education policy since 2010. If you go back and read that essay, it has everything in it which David Willetts would espouse, and it also has in nuce a outline of income contingent repayment loans as the appropriate way to fund undergraduate provision. So Friedman writes, education is a form of investment in human capital, precisely analogous to investment in machinery, buildings, or other forms of non-human capital. Its function is to raise the economic productivity of the human being. If it does so, the individual is rewarded in a free enterprise society by receiving a higher return for his services. It's that last sentence that's key, because this is one of the sort of ideological coordinates of things like the graduate earnings, the longitudinal earnings outcomes, is that those who've received a better education do better in terms of salary, because they're getting that direct reward for their higher productivity. So this is the 2016 white paper. And this I think is on the front page or the third page of that document. Increasing productivity will be the main driver of economic growth in years to come, and improving skills are an essential component of this. The Teaching Excellence Technical Consultation, paragraph 3. The TEF will help to drive UK productivity by ensuring a better match of graduate skills with the needs of employer and the needs of the economy. Now, that's, I think, how Treasury government envisages what it wants to get from the funding it's putting into undergraduate provision. But at the same time, there's a clear, I think, breakdown in trust in the institutions, in this partnership between the Treasury funding institutions to deliver that undergraduate provision. Degree inflation. What does it mean? What does a 2-1 mean if 70% of graduates are getting a 2-1 or better, and if 25% get a first? So when I left as a student in the late 90s, my undergraduate degree, about 7 to 10% of graduates were getting firsts, and now it's 25%. Graduates in non-graduate jobs, there's been an awful lot of reports about this, the most prominent being the CIPD, the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, have been putting out these reports regularly about the number of graduates in non-graduate jobs. Earnings, what we would call the graduate premium, the boost you get between a graduate salary and a non-graduate salary, appears to be declining in recent years. Complaints from employers about a lack of skills, of course, they're always there. But also, what we've seen recently is the OECD complaining about the English system, that if you look at numeracy and literacy skills, England comes off the worst for its undergraduates. Many of those undergraduates should be in FE, getting a different kind of training, rather than HE. I'll show you a graph on this subsequently. And the general macroeconomic issue, this UK productivity. It takes French and German workers 4 days to produce what a British one does in 5. We're funding the universities to boost UK productivity. We need to see some evidence of this in a certain sense. So this is Joe Johnson speaking in 2015, and this is probably when the language is the most bullish. So this is a certain sense where before the various compromises have been reached, which we'll see today, but telling the all-parliamentary group what the problem is with higher education. So graduates from our universities are twice as likely to have weak basic skills as the OECD average and have not benefited from their investment going to university, as we would all want. For these graduates, the returns to university qualifications are modest, with many not earning enough to reimburse their study loans. The other thing to say here is obviously also not paying the additional premium in income tax. So income tax change is as much part of this as repaying loans. They are part of a bigger picture, which is that between 20% and 60% of graduates aren't in graduate jobs. The average earning premium, a crude proxy for the value add of university in terms of enhanced productivity, is declining. It's negligible, non-existent, or even negative for significant numbers of graduates towards the bottom end of the earnings distribution. And at the end, I will show you back up this statement of Johnson's with some of the figures that he has in mind. But that's basically a summary of what I showed you on the previous graph. This is the 2015 Green Paper on degree inflation. The Higher Education Academy found that nearly half of institutions had changed their degree algorithms to ensure that their students were not disadvantaged compared to those in other institutions. And also, I might add, to boost their value add score on university league tables or other league tables, such as the Guardian's, where the value add is very prominent. Over 70% of graduates now get a first or a 2-1, compared with 47% in the mid-90s. In 2013-14, over 50% of students were awarded a 2-1, suggesting that this grade band not only disguises considerable variation in attainment, but also permits some to coast. Now, this is the OECD report I mentioned. I think it should also be able to see it on that TV over there if this is a bit pale. But what this is showing is university students with literacy and numeracy skills and where they fall. And you can see that England is at the bottom of this chart, leading to this thing I've already included on the slide, that this tells us there's something wrong. The incentives are wrong in the system, that people are going into HE rather than other levels of training after they leave school. Yes?
Just looking at your graph, it's very interesting. But as you maybe can tell from my accent, where's Scotland? I think you've got Northern Ireland.
I've got Northern Ireland, and haven't got Wales there either. I don't know, actually. I'll have to...
Because often the comparisons are made.
This is a review of England, so that is a good question. And I know there's been lots of debate in Scottish Parliament about these issues. And just for some light relief, those of you who remember Edwina Currie, I use this just to give an indication of a kind of sense I get when I'm in meeting people in Parliament. Here she is mistakenly tweeting at a professor of macroeconomics at the University of Birmingham. All those university degrees were supposed to improve productivity, but you chose media studies instead of maths. So some of the things I'm showing you hook onto a general discourse about Mickey Mouse degrees, for example. And at the end, I'm going to sort of concentrate a bit on why some subjects have more problems than others in this new terrain. So that's the general sense. There's a clear, I think, indication that the government doesn't trust institutions. And what we're going to move to when we get a kind of regulated market is the replacement, this has been happening over several decades in a certain sense, but the replacement of collegial professional trust in academics and institutions to replace with a regulated market where certain kinds of information provision make universities accountable in a new way to employers and students, graduates, and the government. I'm quickly going to run through these slides just to reiterate the government's position as investor here, and I think this is the best way to really see what's going on. Oh yes, this is a good quote. So Conor Ryan, Director of Research at the Sutton Trust, which is interested in social mobility, social equity, has a quote included in a letter that Joe Johnson sent to the House of Lords back in March when the bill was first being amended. And this is, I think, is a kind of telling quote. We need to shake the university sector out of its complacency and open it up to a transparency that has been alien to them for far too long. It's good that they are judged on impact in the research excellence framework, and that the teaching excellence framework will force them to think more about how they impart knowledge to those paying them $9,000 a year in fees. This kind of level of resentment, I think, is kind of astonishing coming from an independent, charitable think tank. I'm going to skip the unit of resource stuff. I'm going to show you this chart, which is a bit of the accounting. This is the amount of loans in billions that the government issues each year along the top. So you can see that in this current year, the year we've just moved into, this 2017-18 now, financial year, about 17 billion of loans will be issued to all students. That's across the country, but Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland are about 1.5 billion of that. And this is the repayments coming in. So that's the repayments from all previous graduates, so everyone going back to sort of those who started in 98. And so long as there's this shortfall, this is the contribution to the public sector net cash requirement, and that drives public debt. So every year the government chooses to borrow that shortfall, 16 billion, 17 billion, 18 billion, and that's added to the public debt over and above the contribution the deficit makes. So this, I kind of stress this is an awful lot of money, and it's much higher in cash terms than was previously going into the sector. Skip that one. The issue then is what's classically called moral hazard. And I'll draw your attention to the second bullet point. The question now, I think, is, now that there's no longer this general belief in the generic value of undergraduate degree, we're not in the years of Tony Blair's neo-endogenous growth theory, education, let's send 50% to university. Doesn't matter what degree they do. There's now much more concern about overinvestment, misinvestment, and particularly the issue of around what might be called credentialism or signalling as opposed to a human capital investment model. I'm happy to take questions on that afterwards. I don't intend to concentrate too much on what those distinctions are all about here. The one I draw you to at the end is from Gary Becker's book on the theory of the family, that children can default on market debt contracted for them by working less energetically or by entering occupations with lower earnings and higher psychic income. This, I take, is the kind of challenge for government, and the government initially, through this new kind of information provision, wants to nudge those children, and one of the main things to have concerns about in the new regime is how we're asking very young people to make these kind of decisions, but to nudge them into occupations which do see higher earnings and potentially. And to those of you familiar with things like the public sector pay freeze, it's not as if teaching and nursing are benefiting from higher psychic income at the moment either. So that's the that's the sort of the general terrain of the human capital investment. And I think this is the government as investor. It's putting this money into universities. There's certain things it wants to see come back, and the loan structure exemplifies this this theory in a key way. The stuff on standards, I would say, is new, and I will talk a little bit about this. This, I think, since 2015, we've embarked on quite a different approach to this question of standards, and in a certain sense, Joe Johnson and Theresa May have very different ideas about standards than David Willetts and others did. And I think, I've used this as a tagline that hopefully is visible. The idea that university means university, I think, is going to be a key part of, let's say, if there's a continuation of personnel and policy after the general election, then I think this is what we will see. So there was those of you who haven't followed what's been happening in the House of Lords too closely for the last few months, I'm going to spare you the details of this, but there were a series of disputes over the inclusion of the word standards in the higher education bill. And lots of those in the House of Lords who are involved in the university sector wanted to maintain this difference between quality, which we're used to being assessed through things like institutional audit, which looks at processes and mechanisms and structures of quality enhancement and quality assurance, as opposed to standards, which seems to give the government license to come in and start dealing with that terrain that's traditionally been seen as part of institutional autonomy and academic freedom. So some of the amendments in the Lords were cross out standards here, cross out standards here, cross out standards, all the way through. And one of the early compromises that was reached in March is the government and Universities UK and GuildHEA agreed to position this differently and remove some of those more controversial wordings and clauses. But this is what Joe Johnson sort of pledged. And I'm going to show you what the UK and GuildHEA said on the next slide, but I want you to keep these in mind because I don't think they're saying precisely the same thing. And this is going to be kind of key for what I suggest to you, is that the next phase of policy is going to see a struggle over standards and the interpretation of standards in terms of the legislation, the role of the Office for Students, and the traditional demarcation of what was appropriate for academics and institutions to decide and what's appropriate for the regulator to have a say in. So Joe Johnson's letter from February is, we are in fierce agreement that the standards are and should continue to be set by the sector. I can therefore confirm that we have today tabled amendments that will guarantee, amongst other things, that the standards against which providers are assessed are the standards that are determined by and command the confidence of the higher education sector. I'd say that's not the same thing as saying standards are the responsibility of institutions as autonomous entities or of academics. It's a collective agreement about sector standards, but there's not a commitment here for what Universities UK and GuildHEA seem to suggest, which is, and this is their letter from the 2nd of March, following on from that letter from Joe Johnson. We believe that the bill originally drafted was unclear about the difference between threshold standards, i.e. what's in institutional audit, and academic standards, what the role the Office for Students should play in standards, and the vital importance that institutions retain the independence to define academic standards. This has been one of our most pressing concerns about the bill over the last 9 months, and we are most appreciative of the time peers spent dissecting, debating the question of standards during the committee stage. Now, I want to sort of interrogate this idea of sector's own standards by looking at some stuff that is already in train, that's already been happening since 2015 outside of the progress of the Higher Education and Research Bill. Hefce has already reinterpreted the 1992 Further and Higher Education Act to conclude that it has responsibility for standards across the sector and the comparability of degree standards across the sector, as opposed to focusing on quality. So in November, a new standing committee for quality assessment was introduced, and its remit is to ensure the reliability of degree standards, including projects of developing training for external examiners, approaches to the calibration of standards, and a review of degree classification algorithms. So my gloss, this is not simply about the threshold standards of institutional audit. Hefce has reinterpreted its remit here. And my assumption, and this is what I'm expecting to see today and next year when the Office for Students is inaugurated at the beginning of April 2018, they will take over from Hefce in this regard. And a regulator, not a sector-owned body, will have responsibility for academic and threshold standards to a certain degree. And the other thing to flick in here is that these it's the interpretation of standards as outcomes around things like things in the TEF basket of metrics, completion rates, outcomes, earnings, all of which the sector would agree is part of the complicated provision that universities offer to their students. You would say these are part of the standards of our provision. It's how they then get wrapped up into different kinds of metric and accountability systems. So again, the Green Paper is, probably not many people read it these days, but it's only 18 months ago, and it's much more forthright in terms of government vision. I mean, there's lots of stuff in the Green Paper and the White Paper which aren't in the Higher Education Research Bill because they don't require primary legislation to enact. It's vital to all higher education institutions that they can show that academic output standards are being maintained. Students rightly want hard work at university to be recognised and for their degree to be a currency that carries prestige and holds its value. At the same time, businesses need a degree classification system that will help them identify the best applicants for their firms. And the key issue here is the 2221 SIFT. Whether you interview, who you shortlist, etc. This is a significant challenge facing the sector. We believe that the standard UK model of honours degree classification is on its own no longer capable of providing the recognition hard-working students deserve and the information employers require. Now, I take that to be a pretty bold thing for the Minister to say, effectively, and one that hasn't had much general coverage in the sector. Now, what I'm going to outline in this next slide is where I think this struggle over standards will take place over the next 5 to 10 years. Okay, the TEF submission. Those of you who've been involved with it know that you were supposed to outline, or you were encouraged to outline, I'm not quite sure on the exact stress, whether it was should, must, encouraged to, how grade inflation is being combated and whether you're using GPA for more differentiation. In future TEF baskets, and this timetable is going to be slightly delayed by what happens around the passage of the bill into law today, there'll be the composition of the basket will shift, and we'll see proportion of graduates in highly skilled employment and LEO, longitudinal earnings outcomes, will probably be in a TEF basket originally planned for 2020, but as I'm going to show you, LEO is already published, it's already out there, and some of it will be incorporated into the new destination of levers of higher education. External examiners review. Again, this is one I think I haven't really seen much discussion of this. The Higher Education Academy report in 2015 said external examiners review is not fit for purpose currently around the key function of ensuring comparability of standards across subjects and institutions. So the proposals are training for external examiners and regular meetups to calibrate standards across subjects. Hefce has declared that it seeks to, in light of that review, it seeks to further professionalise external examiners. There will be a review of degree classification algorithms and the use of benchmark data to see how different institutions are approaching this question. There's the new graduate voice in the revised destination levers of higher education, where graduates will be asked about the sense of meaningfulness of importance of their jobs and their careers, whether they're utilising what they learned at university, and how it's helped them to orient towards future goals. Again, these aren't things you can really disagree with. It's the classic motherhood and apple pie, but it becomes very different once these are brought into certain kinds of metric baskets. I did think about talking about learning game, but I won't say too much about it, except that I think we will inevitably move towards an independent test of graduate skills, particularly around numeracy, reading comprehension, critical thinking. It's particularly interesting that Michael Barber is going to be the chair of the Office for Students, because obviously his connection with Pearson mean you have a proctoring set up. I mean, I think that one of the things the sector might be sort of less... what's the word? Perhaps too sanguine about, is the thing that the universities would have to be involved in any learning gain assessment. That's not the case at all. The government has plenty of experience with fast-track graduate entrance exams. It has the connection to Pearson to provide proctoring, and through loans it has a mechanism to incentivise students to participate outside of their engagement with outside of the official university channel. And the thing I will talk a bit more when I come to the end is the return to the proposal in the Brown Review to only make loans eligible for students who hit a minimum UCAS benchmark. Again, Michael Barber was heavily involved in the drafting of the Brown Review. This is one of the proposals that we all forgot about, but if you go back and read it, and I'll probably show you the slide in a minute, it's quite clear that this is a solution to one of the things I was showing you before, which is at the moment there's no control on loan outlay. Any eligible student, home and currently EU, who has a place at a university can get access to tuition fee and maintenance support. There's not clearly at the moment any mechanism for the Treasury to control that outlay and for the Department of Education to manage its budget. The Brown proposal on UCAS tariffs is a clear solution, and again, it wouldn't challenge institutional autonomy. You're not telling universities which person they can admit, you're saying which ones you're prepared to provide loan funding to. A very different kind of indirect interference. So I'm going to skip over the quality wars. Some of you will remember that we've been here before around registered external examiners. That was in the Deering report. People pulled away from it for various reasons. But you know, if you want, I've been looking at this stuff again recently because it looks to me like we're going to have a sort of rerun of what was going on in the late 90s. So I'll just show you that quickly in case people are interested in asking about that afterwards. We have a certain kind of standard wars, which looks similar to quality wars from the 90s, with again the key issue around what are external examiners doing? Is it their function to ensure comparability of standards across the sector? And would that mean in a certain sense that you would have external examiners reporting to the QAA or to the Office for Students, becoming some kind of quasi-inspectorate? I'll skip that because that's just more signs of resentment from different places. Okay, I make it that I've got about 10 more minutes on my schedule. I've given you the sort of the first part of my 3 prongs, standard wars. There's the stuff on competition which I'm probably going to move over quite quickly because it is kind of a bit opaque at the moment what this will mean. And then I want to get to the longitudinal earnings outcomes because I think that's really the stuff which people will be less familiar with and is also, you know, fascinating in the good and bad sense. So I don't think we're in the market, what I call the market Maoism of David Willetts anymore in terms of competition. I would say that David Willetts' idea was remove the barriers to entry, let 1,000 providers bloom, and then the market will sort out the quality. I did a lot of work with The Guardian on how that basically failed, and that we had a huge loss of public investment in some very shoddy institutions back in 2013. And when I introduced this, the other function of standards, I could say much more about it, and I'm going to try and keep this quite brief, is that's Theresa May, for example, and people like Nick Timothy are much less relaxed about standards in this context. If you read the supplementary things put out by the Department for Education around what's going to happen with degree awarding powers and the granting of degree awarding powers to new providers, they have a completely different idea of the entrants that are going to come in, the new providers. And they really have 3. There's a document which outlines their 3 case studies of what they're expecting to see come in. World-class research companies, Google DeepMind, for example, Dyson, maybe say a bit about Dyson in questions. US and Chinese universities coming in and setting up quickly. Or, and I think this is the key one, high-level academics who can attract private equity backing or money fund backing to spin off and set up their own institution. This to me has business school all over it. And this is particularly key, I think, for the sector because business schools provide a lot of cross-subsidy that the institution uses. If you were a money fund that went to a high-profile business school and offered to take their star professors and set up on their own, you might see a lot of people jump ship. I think this is the one to really, really watch. I just flag this up because, again, people sometimes think that most of this stuff is all happening in the Higher Education Research Bill, but what's called Hefce designation has already been changed. It was changed in 2015, and that means that for-profit companies can apply to Hefce to be eligible for grants. So it's not just that their students can access loans, which is SLC designation. This is Hefce designation, and it means that already these kind of new providers and alternative providers can access high-cost teaching subsidy, so Band B in the main, capital grants and QR funding. Although I haven't yet seen many people move into this. This has already changed on the ground. I'm going to skip over this slide, except to point out that there's going to be a new National Audit Office inquiry into value for money in HE and how students are empowered to act as effective consumers. And I won't say too much about this, except to say that this is really, again, this is in this DFE release from January 2017. This is going from startup to university and degree awarding powers. UT here is university title, DAP is degree awarding powers. This is kind of going from 0 to a university in 7 years. And those of you who are interested in the financial questions, 5 to 7 years is the classic private investment cycle. You put your money in and you want to kind of cash out after 5 to 7 years. So this is the kind of model that would be used for those new high-quality entrants to bring them in very quickly, so that they're competing with established provision, not doing what the last phase of private expansion did and effectively offering a subprime higher education to communities not familiar with it and offering it to students who can't really benefit from it, which would be my quick and dirty gloss on what happened between 2010 and 2015. So this is the competition. It's going to be a very different kind of competition, and one that's expected to put universities under pressure, particularly if you think about this issue of cross-subsidy and whether you have resentful department heads who see they're recruiting lots of students. I'm sorry, apology for the caricature, recruiting lots of students, they're not keeping the surplus. That surplus is going elsewhere to fund expensive medical science facilities or other building projects. If you offer them the chance to go and start up their own institution with private equity backing and to be effectively delivering degrees in year 1 and maybe getting university title by year 7, you're putting a very different proposition in front of people. Right, I'm going to talk about information now, and I'm not going to really talk about the TEF here because I think it's more interesting to see the longitudinal earnings data and to see how the two things run against each other, TEF and Leo, have different stories to tell in a certain sense. So this is kind of me moving to a conclusion. This is my kind of general understanding of the settlement. We're no longer in a cost-based model of provision. We're moving to a credit-based model with the Treasury as lender keen to know more about the return on its investment. Universities are to be judged by how well they do provide training that increases graduate earnings profiles and national productivity, because, and again, in the free market economy, earnings are the single best indicator that someone has received that boost to their productivity. And this is what I have elsewhere called financialization. That is, the graduate becomes the bearer of a unit of accounting in this system. You know, they're the way the new accounting schema works across the system. So here's, again, to quote from Milton Friedman, just to give you a sense of how prescient this essay is. The repayment demanded on loans for higher education should in principle vary from individual to individual in accordance with any differences in expected earning capacity that can be predicted in advance. The problem is similar to that of varying life insurance premia among groups that have different life expectancy. That is, how much should this applicant from this district of this city with these qualifications be lent to do this course at this institution? What are they likely to pay? A good university is one that produces graduates able to repay more and pay higher income tax. And as I've said, the graduate borrower is therefore the bearer of the unit of accounting. Now, I'll just show this quickly because I've mentioned it. This is the quote from the Brown Review, Securing a Sustainable Future for Higher Education. This is their recommendation. Rather than create a new test of aptitude, which the government commissioned a test of university aptitude in 2005, which it reported in 2010, like a test for university entrance. Rather than going back to that idea, the Brown proposal builds on UCAS tariff admissions, which is currently used by around 70% of full-time undergraduates. The minimum entry tariff standard will be set every year by government shortly after the UCAS deadline for receiving applications. So this is one of the key aspects of how these different sets of information will dovetail. So you're prepared to loan to people who meet a minimum standard. Finally, longitudinal earnings outcomes. Right, I just very quickly show you this graph. This is the projection of repayments of student loans. So students graduate with 50, 60,000 pounds of debt, and depending on where they are in the graduate lifetime's earning distribution, this is how much they will repay. Income contingent repayment loans provide an awful lot of protection to low earners, this bit here. You know, and on the new scheme, even these lower deciles repay less than they would have done under the previous scheme, even with higher graduating debt. Here's the ambiguity. The government has a general average loss on loans of about 25p in the pound that it lends, but you can obviously see that different bits are have very different relationships to that loan repayment. And the question then is, as from a public policy issue, and I'm ventriloquizing here, just to reiterate, it's how do you improve this area here? How do you bring these up? So here's David Willetts speaking in 2012, and he, in effect, pushed through changes to legislation that enabled the data that I'm going to show you in a minute to be published. It's HMRC data, so it was previously protected, not available to the public in any form. I expect that in the future, as the data accrue, the policy debate will be about the non-repayment rate for individual institutions, the actual exchequer risk from lending to students at specific universities. Imagine that in the future we discover that the non-repayment rate for a Bristol graduate was 10%, so they repay 90% of what they've been loaned. Maybe some other university we're only going to get 60% back. Going beyond that, it becomes an interesting question to what extent you can incentivize universities to lower their own RAB charges. Now, we now have the data. I'm firstly just going to show you this because it's important to kind of get in mind about the shape of the sector. Some of the concerns you might, on the next few graphs, might not be very clear. You know, what's the big deal? But it's important to realize that we have, for example, 150,000 arts and design students compared to, say, 40,000 maths undergraduates. So the concerns around art and design is a function, for example, not just of the data, but also the number of students doing the subject. And again, to sort of ventriloquize, you don't have to be a Philistine to be worried, in a certain sense, about lending £60,000 to 150,000 art and design students. Okay, so here's the first of the Longitudinal outcomes data that came out in December. This is by subject, and this is 2004 graduates 10 years after graduation. Now, first thing to flag up is the lag in this data is going to be really crucial to thinking about this. You know, if institutions are going to be judged on this, they're being judged on their graduates who joined the institution in, 15 to 20 years ago in some cases. But you can see the spread here. So this is a box plot. We've got the blue square is the median earnings of those graduates. The purple is the lower quartile, so 25% of graduates are below this. And here's the triangle is the upper earnings quartile, so 25% are above this. And the concerns in a certain sense are down this end. I mean, this is much of a muchness. There's some big boosts here, so economics, mathematical sciences, law, but something like creative arts and design looks problematic. This means that 25% of creative art and design graduates 10 years out from graduation are earning 12,000 or less. And these are the people in employment. This isn't like dragged down by people who aren't in the labour market or have left the country or anything like that. That's the same one. I think this one is a bit unclear. I don't know if this is completely illegible. This is splitting that data. This is the IFS splitting that data by male and female graduates. And this is 2008-9, so 5 years out rather than 10 years out. And you can see there's the males over here, there are bigger spreads. But it's not dissimilar in terms of the pattern in a certain sense. I think certain subjects jump around. So which one jumps around? Computer science, I think, is very different for women compared to men. But the concern again is, creative arts and designs. These male graduates are earning less than male non-graduates. And again, I'm sorry, this is a similar problem. This I think is more interesting. This is the UCAS tariff split. So the top is people with applicants with 240 or below 5 years after graduation, and this is applicants with 360 and above after graduation. You can see for these students, law is very different, for example, but also computer science does a good job in a certain sense. Again, the concerns are around creative art and design, and whether, in a certain sense, the last phase of expansion from 2004 saw a lot of low tariff students going into creative arts and design would be one question to begin asking. Now, the one I'd like to show you is the first of the real stuff. So you just have to bear with me while I flick here. Hopefully this is legible. If not, there's a screen over here. I'm going to talk through it. These are law graduates by institution. So instead of just getting the subject, here we have law graduates by institution, and this is effectively big data. This is all of the graduates. So if you read it, all of the institutions are here, down. This is the whole chart. So we've got Bradford at the far left, Oxford at the far right. Again, it's a box plot with lower quartile, median, upper quartile, and that's salary up the right-hand side. So 25% of Oxford law graduates 5 years out are earning, if I keep a straight arm here, nearly over 80,000. 25%, for example, here of Middlesex University law graduates are earning less than 12,000. Keele is somewhere in the middle. Oh, I had it before, and now it's disappeared. It might be because here we go. Here's Keele. So Keele's in the middle. Now, this is the thing I sort of want to end with, is the ambiguity. What is going on here? What stories do you have to tell about what's going on behind this data? It tells you one picture about, we don't really have a unitary higher education system in England. We've got an enormous unequal opportunity provision exemplified by what's going on the far right-hand side. And we might hypothesize that, well, this is largely to do with capture of city jobs by institutions or something like that. It isn't the case, for example, that if we created another LSE, duplicated it somehow, that we would get that same data. There's a positional good issue here. But the other question is what's going on down here? And to reiterate, this is law. So this is what you would consider to be a vocational professional degree at some point. But there's obviously concerns about this lower end, which will be clear to government. Now, we were supposed to get all of this data for every subject next month, but because of the general election, it's kind of purdah, so we're not going to get these breakdowns by subject. But this is effectively it's going to be difficult in a certain sense for institutions, because we've got if you just look at this data, there are some institutions that are going to get gold on the TEF, which are down on this left-hand side, and we're going to get bronze institutions on the right. And this is also, for those of you who've been following kind of the stuff around the TEF, this is the raw data. This isn't benchmarked in any way. Lots of the Russell Group universities are going to be complaining that benchmarking disadvantages them, and what they want is an absolute measure of teaching excellence. This kind of gives you that absoluteness. And the questions will be, when this becomes more prominent as information, what does it do for applicants? Will applicants look at the badge of the TEF, or will they be looking at this earnings data? I'm probably going to leave it there because I know we're running out of time, and this is the point I wanted to get to, and also the point to sort of say, for me, this is a sort of new intellectual terrain. We don't really have the resources to draw upon historically to know what to say about this. We've got some common sense ideas that this tallies with, but I don't think I certainly when I saw it, didn't think it would be this stark. And certainly I didn't expect these figures at the end to be quite so dramatic. So this is just to sort of summarize and hopefully have a bit of time for questions. I think these three things together, the new form of competition, a new accountability around standards, and new forms of information provision really create a different kind of settlement for English higher education, one which is largely designed to demonstrate that government investment is well placed. And the initial idea, I think, will be to nudge applicants this way, make different choices, to nudge them from left to right institutions. But at a certain point, if that isn't prominent enough, then you can bring in things like the UCAS tariff requirement for loans to make a different kind of intervention here. And so, that's worrying for traditional understandings of the place of academics, I would say in this. That, the alternative to academics as a sort of professional cadre who safeguard standards, and that is how degree awarding powers are currently articulated. Degree awarding powers are given to an institution where there's a self-critical community of academics safeguarding standards. Much more here towards academics as frontline delivery staff with a market regulator and a certain kind of information provision regime dominating in a new form.